So I recently varnished one of my paintings this week, and I thought I'd share my top tips for varnishing your painting. But first, it's important to check before you finish your painting if it's ready to varnish. For example, does it have an even surface? Varnish will make each part of your painting equally more glossy, so you can't rely on it to restore an even amount of luster to the whole piece, or resolve any dry or uneven or sunken areas. Most artists will fix this by oiling out at the end of their painting. This means applying a layer of oil medium over the surface of their whole painting, but overdoing oil can darken or yellow the painting over time. So it's best to oil out only the dry area. Specifically, you can add oil over that area that you find sunken rather than over your whole piece. But the best thing to do is just keep aware as you're painting, especially if you're using notoriously dull or sunken colors like umbers. You may need to add a little bit more oil medium into those sections of your painting just to match the luster of the other colors that you're using. So oiling out a specific area is really just sort of a last minute way to resolve any unevenness. Really, you just want to be considering the evenness of your painting as you go. So first and foremost, you want to make sure that your painting is fully dry, not just touch dry, before you varnish. So that means leaving your painting at least 3 to 6 months. It can sometimes be even longer if you use very thick paint and a slow drying oil. Like the drying times in oil paint is very hard to pin down because different colors take a different amount of time to dry. Different oils you use take a different amount of time. If you paint very thickly, it'll take longer than if you apply very thin paint. So you kind of have to consider what oil you've used, what style you've used to understand how long it is before your painting is fully dry. Because I wouldn't recommend doing any tests, for example, like pressing your finger into your painting to decide if it's dry or not. It's really a case of understanding the drying times of oil paints. I typically just wait at least 6 months to be sure. In that time, I store my painting carefully. Sometimes I even hang them up on the wall. So that means that your painting can kind of collect dust during that time. So before I varnish, I'll take a brush and just dust the surface of my painting very carefully to make sure that you don't lock in any dust with the varnish. You may want to do this not in the same area of your painting where you're going to varnish it. And sometimes I'll actually vacuum my studio the day or a couple of days before if you just want to be in as dust-free environment as possible. So next, as well as a dust-free space, you want to be in as well-ventilated space as possible because varnishes can be pretty smelly and you don't want to be breathing it in for a long period of time. So having some place to leave it where you're not going to be breathing it is also a good idea. So next you want to shake your varnish well and pour it not directly on the painting because that can cause damage, but rather pour it into a little pot or tub instead. Then what you want to do is take a flat brush that you only use for varnishing and apply the varnish in thin strokes in one direction. You want to not go over the same area loads of times and make sure you try to remove any bubbles as you go. It's best to apply about 3 thin layers as opposed to 1 thick layer and wait for them to dry for 24 hours in between the layers. You want to leave the painting with the varnish on it to dry flat and also do something to prevent dust landing into the varnish. And what I usually do is sort of DIY a little plastic tent using recycled plastic wrappers from things or garbage bags or something, just so that dust doesn't settle into the painting as it dries. I think you can buy little tents, but I tend to just set one up based on the size of my painting, whether you stick it under a table or under, in this case, a little stool. This can also prevent smells from spreading around a room. Then you want to leave, as I said, 24 hours before you apply another coat. And when you do apply another coat, you can add it at a right angle to the first one. So put your brushes and your brush strokes in a different direction. A lot of artists skip the varnishing step, but it is very important. I never used to varnish my paintings when I was in art school, and now I had to go back and kind of add varnish to them. I think sometimes the challenge is that you have to wait at least 3 to 6 months before you can varnish an oil painting. Otherwise, the varnish, there's no point to it because it'll just adhere to the last layers of paint. You want it to be a completely separate layer. But this can be a challenge if you have deadlines or if someone bought your painting and has a timeline that they want it. And so it's just good to know about the drying times because you sort of have to communicate to clients that either they're going to have to wait a little longer or you may have to have the painting back to varnish it later. I've known of people who actually have gone to the site where the painting is hanging and just varnished it on site and then left it there. But varnishing isn't just about making your painting glossy, but it does an important job for protecting your work, especially to protect it into the future. It's basically like a piece of protective glass on your iPhone that you have to protect it. It's the layer that'll absorb all the damage and dust over time, and you can remove this layer. So when damage and dust builds up, you can remove that layer of varnish and reapply it, and it will restore the painting back to new. And it just becomes a buffer so that it's the varnish and not the actual painting that's being damaged. So hopefully this helps to just clarify some of the basics and some little tips for if you're varnishing your painting, especially an oil painting. Again, like I never used to do it, now I do it all the time, and it's just such a good habit to get into just to keep your paintings protected into the future and have them last a long time.